Today we're going to work on the learning target. I can compare and contrast one author's presentation of events with that of another. Today we have two articles. Both of them are about Amelia Earhart. One of them is by Brian Vargas and one of them is by Anne Randall. They're both biographies, so they're the same genre, which means we're going to have to look at the specific details within each one to try to uncover each of the author's perspectives and then see how their perspectives are slightly different. So let's start with our first one. As a famous female aviator, Amelia Earhart did much to advance equality for women. In 1928, she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic and spent the rest of her life fearlessly flying farther, faster. Earhart was the first to fly many long, dangerous routes, and she encouraged other women to fly. She championed women in the sciences as a guest professor at Purdue University. She said, "Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others." Our second article, Born to Fly. Amelia Earhart didn't always dream of becoming an aviator. While she had seen airplanes growing up, it wasn't until her early 20s that she realized she was born to fly. When Earhart was 20 years old, she and a friend attended a stunt flying contest. Their fun ended, however, when one of the planes came zooming toward them. In spite of the danger, Earhart stood firm, displaying the same fearlessness that she would continue to show all her life. This encounter proved to be a sign of things to come. Just a few years later, Earhart found herself flying inside an airplane. On December 28, 1920, pilot Frank Hawks changed Earhart's life by taking her on her first plane ride. It was then that she knew she was meant to be in the air. Earhart attended her first flying lesson just 5 days later, and by 1922 she was already setting records. She became the first woman to fly to an altitude of 14,000 feet. Over the next 15 years, Earhart would continue to make her mark on the record books time and time again, proving that flying was truly in her blood. So the first thing we want to do is find how the two articles are the same. In both articles, we're obviously talking about Amelia Earhart, and in both articles, we can see that Earhart is portrayed as an aviator, which just means that she is a flyer. In both articles, whether they use the exact same words or not, it talks about Earhart was the first to do something, that she was kind of a record setter. So in this article, it talks about how she can set records. And in this one, it says basically the same thing when it talks about she was the first to fly many long, dangerous routes. So that's kind of how it talks about how she does things the same. It also talks about how she's fearless in this one, and in this one it talks about how she has fearlessness. So those are the similarities in the two articles. Now that we know how the articles are the same, we want to look at how the articles are different, because that'll kind of reveal to us how the authors have slightly different perspectives. The first thing that I noticed that is different is the title. On this one, it talks about how Earhart on equality. And there's a word that appears in this article over and over and over again. On this one, it talks about how she was a famous female aviator and how she was trying to advance equality for women. She talks about how she was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic and how she was trying to do that, she was encouraging other women to fly, how she was championing women in the sciences, and how she said that women must try to do things that men should do, and if they fail, that she have to challenge others, and when they talk about challenging others, they meant challenging other women. This article seemed to be less about what Earhart had done herself, but more about what she had encouraged other women to do, and even the title talks about that, where it's equality for women. So while this article does talk about how Amelia Earhart was an aviator who had set records and was fearless, it's really more about how she was a champion for women's rights. And so the purpose of this article was more about how she was helping the women's rights movement. Let's compare that to the second article. Amelia Earhart didn't always dream to be an aviator, but when she was challenged in the stunt flying competition, it kind of changed her perspective on the world. So she had this plane come zooming at her, and then she stood firm, and that kind of changed her perspective on the world, and later she became a pilot. So it says in December 28th, a pilot changed her perspective on life, so Earhart's life. Took her up on a plane. She knew she was meant to be up in the air. She attended her first flying lesson 5 days later. She was the first woman to fly to an altitude. So it does talk about woman here, but notice in this this article, it talks about female, woman, 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 woman. That word came up lots of times. This is the first time that word woman came up in this article. It says over the next 15 years, she continued to make her mark on the record books time and time again, and that flying was truly in her blood. In this particular article, it seems to be more of just a sequence of events in her life. This seems to be more of a true biography of the things that happened in Amelia Earhart's life. So if I want to compare and contrast the two articles, there's some things that I have to point out that are the same. Between the two articles, if I wanted to say what is the same, I would say that they're both about Amelia Earhart, who was an aviator, who set records, who was fearless, and did many amazing things. But if I want to compare and contrast now and look at what's different, it seems that this first article is more about how Amelia Earhart was a champion for women's rights. The second article didn't seem to have that same perspective or that same theme. This seemed to be more of a true biography that was just giving facts on her life. Knowing that the perspective is different on the two articles, I would read them for a slightly different reason. If I was wanting to learn more about the outcome or the impact of her life, I might choose this first article. This really talked about how Amelia Earhart changed the lives of other people, how she was able to impact the lives of women and move them forward throughout history. If I just wanted to know how she was able to have an impact on her own life and the details of her specific life, I might choose the second article because it's more about the sequence of events in her own life. So today we worked on comparing and contrast one author's presentations of events with that of another. There are similarities. They're both about Amelia Earhart and how she's an aviator who did amazing things and was very fearless. However, the perspective of the two authors is slightly different, and therefore they presented facts slightly different. This one had fewer details because it wasn't focusing on all the details of her life. It was more so just about how she was a champion for women's rights, and therefore it only really included the details that were on how she helped women's rights. This one, because it was more of a broad picture of a biography, included more details of her life and had a true sequence of events. When you want to compare and contrast these details, you have to look first for how the details are the same, and then look for the specific details that are different. And when you find those details, it will give you a greater insight into the perspective of the specific authors.